I'll tell you, uh, big concern, 25% tariff
Mm,
can really, it's like a bowling ball coming through, just for Canada, if that's imposed on Canada economically, it's going to be a very serious hit for Canada. All right, with regard to money, the way I'm taking it now, if your name is John Paul Getty the second or whatever, you don't have to worry about money or, Bill Gates' son or daughter or whatever. So I'm talking about just normal, ordinary people. All right, so uh, balance is all about values, and values are subjective for the most part. There are some universal values, in my opinion. Like, for example, don't hurt anyone might
right.
be a universal value. Life is a universal value. Well, I'm an optimist about the future. So, for example, I
Okay.
believe mankind can sort out the problem of climate change, even though it doesn't look like we're doing a good job right now.
Hello, team. Welcome to today's podcast. We're going to be embarking on a journey through a highly impressive, multifaceted career that blends journalism, law, and even human rights advocacy for starters. And we'll be doing this with our guest, who's significantly impacted immigration law in particular across both Canada and the US. And we're also going to take the opportunity to navigate, because of that across the border situation, we're going to take the opportunity to navigate through a little bit of an economic and political minefield, I guess. And then finally, we'll be exploring fresh insights from a newly released book aimed at empowering young professionals in today's challenging career landscape. So please get yourself ready for what's sure to be an engaging conversation filled with many valuable insights for all of us. And help me join in welcoming our guest, Mr. Andy Semotiuk. Andy, welcome to the ET Project. Great to have you here with us today.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here as well. I've been looking forward to this podcast and sharing some views with you and the listeners. So
You have a really
I'm
interesting
primed and ready
scenario.
to go, so to speak.
You have a really interesting background and a very interesting scenario happening in your part of the world at the moment. So we're going to touch on that shortly. But you're our first guest on the show. We've been, 2.5 years in the show now, but you're our first guest from Toronto.
Oh,
So a
wow.
special welcome. Now, because of that, we have listeners from across the globe, and um, I'm going to throw the floor over to you as an opportunity to sell Toronto. Maybe start with a little bit of a geographical where is Toronto for the benefit of those who may not know, and then what's so special about the place?
Well, that's funny you should say that. Toronto is a great place to live. It's for those who are unfamiliar with Canadian sort of geography. If you think of New York and go straight up,
Mhm.
just over a little bit to the left, on the other side of the Canadian border, Toronto, you'll find Toronto on atop of the Great Lakes that divide Canada and the United States. And the population here is probably over 2 million in the
Mhm.
city. And then there's the outskirts as well. And uh, Toronto is part of Canada. It's the leading city in Canada.
Mhm.
Some of the great features of living in Canada are a democratic system of government, fairly reasonable in terms of what's going on politically, universal health care, um, pretty great system of education for all kids going through school, multicultural environment. So there are people here who are living side by side from various parts of the world, and somehow we're getting along more or less. Things are all right. Um, it's not heavily involved for example, in the United States, one of the things that's a big deal is guns and how many guns you can have, etc. That's not quite the situation in Canada.
Right.
Um, we're conscious of the environment, or trying to be at least anyway. Um, and it's a welcoming, open, welcoming society. Toronto is very by and large, people in Toronto are very kind and considerate.
Mhm.
So it's a good city to live in.
Yeah, I can remember sitting in my geography class many, many decades ago and learning about the capital of Canada. And this was always a trick question in the quiz, right? So,
Yeah,
what is the capital of Canada?
it's Ottawa. Ottawa
Mm,
was a compromise. There were the two sort of principal provinces that formed Canada were Ontario and Quebec.
mm,
Back then, there were Upper and Lower Canadas, the way they were described. And there's a little story about that I can share with you.
mm,
The Prime Minister of Canada was a guy named MacDonald, and they were trying to come up with a name for Canada, and they were debating in Parliament, and they just couldn't come up with a name. Uh, And I don't know if the listeners or yourself are aware, but Canadians tend to finish their sentences with the word "a." So I'm Canadian, eh? Do you like, do you like the weather, eh? Where are you going, eh? So, so they're debating, and they couldn't come up with a name for Canada. So Sir John A. Macdonald called all the leaders into a room, and he closed the door, and he said, "We're not leaving this room until we come up with a name." And they debated and debated for a whole day, couldn't come up with a name. So finally he said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go around the table, and each one of us is going to pick a letter from the alphabet. And we're going to put those letters of the alphabet together until we get a name. And so they went around the table, and the first guy said, C, eh? And the second one said, A, eh? And the third one said, D, eh? And so on. And they came up with the name Canada.
mm.
And that's how we got our name.
What year was that? Like, how far back are we going? How many
Oh,
centuries?
1867.
67. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm from Australia. We're actually a little bit older than that, 1770. So
I,
yeah,
we
interesting.
have a lot in common with Australians. Like
Mm,
we talked earlier before came on the air,
yeah,
that there is a lot of common between Canada and the US. I'm sorry,
yeah.
and Australia, because of the weather and so on, and the opposite sides of the globe.
It's definitely on my bucket list. So we may have to organize a trip together.
That would be great. That'd be great.
Normally I kick off by asking the guests to talk a little bit about your background, but you have such an interesting background. I want to make sure I touch on a number of the points. So if you don't mind, I'd love to go through a little bit of a bullet list, starting with your time as a United Nations correspondent back in the mid 70s.
Right.
What was that all about? How did that come about?
Ah, okay. Well, um, I was a UN correspondent working in New York City. Uh, I wrote for a group called Southern News Services, which is a Canadian newspaper chain with several newspapers in Canada and for some American papers as well.
Mhm.
And the way I actually got there was I was a lawyer in Canada, and there was a group that was trying to get accreditation at the UN as an NGO, and they needed a lawyer to do it. And for me to be able to do the work, I had to have access to the UN, and so they arranged for me to get a pass, a journalist pass to be able to work as a journalist. And so I wrote articles on human rights topics, and they were published in, the Southern Chain and a few of the newspapers, both in America and also in Europe.
Mm.
So that was kind of the start of my work in New York, both as a lawyer and as a journalist at the same time. That was in the mid 1970s. I
Wow.
had a chance to. It's funny. Jimmy Carter just passed away. I had a chance to ask him a question in New York. Also, Henry Kissinger, Kurt Waldheim, Idi Amin back in those days, if you know
Wow.
who those people were.
Yes. Well, you can tell by my grey hair. I go back that far as well. So
Yes, yeah.
you must be slightly older than me if and I don't want to put a label on it, but 1975, I was still in high school Um,
Yeah, I just,
grade 10,
yeah,
I think. So,
I just finished getting my bar exams done in
wow,
75. Yeah.
nice, very nice. I was going to mention, like, who are the most famous people you sort of jumped into that
Ah,
question for? But I mean, within this role, did you get a lot of exposure to celebrities and
yes, I
high?
did.
Yeah.
Uh, One of the biggest moments in my life was I met Dr. Martin Luther King's wife, Coretta,
Mm,
and Andrew Young, who was then the ambassador to the UN. Andrew Young was one of Dr. King's close colleagues. So I
yeah.
spoke to them for about a half hour on one occasion. Uh, like when you're at the UN, they have, if you're a journalist at the UN, every day at noon, 12 o'clock noon, they have a news conference. And
Mm,
whoever's coming through at the time who's prominent, many of them choose to come over to talk to the press, and
yeah.
you have a chance to to pose questions. So, like I mentioned, the major ones that I had the
Mm,
opportunity to question were
yeah.
Kissinger, Waldheim, and so on. Also Ford. Um, there were a few others, I can't remember right off the top of my head, but anyway, a few people like that.
So the connection between journalism and law, did you study journalism? Like, did you study writing, or where did that come through?
I did have a little bit of a connection. That was in Canada previously. I had done some work, both, well, primarily on the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. From a legal point of view, I had written some materials, some briefs pertaining to their Broadcasting Act and what they should and should not be doing in terms of
Mhm.
broadcasting in Canada. And that helped to draw me into the journalism
Right.
world. But I can share, and it's a long story, but I'll give you a short version of it. When I started writing in the early days of my life, still while I was a student, I was pathetic in English. Like I took a course called English 101 at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. And I barely got through that course, just barely.
Right.
50% they passed me. And so I was pathetic at writing. And it took a long time for me to kind of crank up my skills, writing skills to the point where I could write articles for, from the United Nations. But
Mm,
it happened just simply because I was writing all the time. If you want to get good at something, do it all
yeah.
the time.
Do it all the
But not
time.
only do it, you have to also study how to improve.
Mhm.
But if you do, I mean, no matter what you do, there's a philosophy of life that goes along the lines of if you take anything that you're really interested in, any field or whatever, and you spend 5 years of focused effort on it, you can
Right.
become virtually a world's expert.
Yeah.
If you focus it carefully enough and you spend enough time at it. So, in a sense, that would be an explanation of how I went from a pathetic writer, that my English prof today would turn over in his grave if he knew that I have published, 5 books, and for the last 10 years, I've been a
College.
contributor at Forbes,
Yeah.
so like, but that's the way it goes, I guess.
I love that. And finally, the connection to civil rights and human rights, or
Yeah.
whatever we call it. But was that something that was a passion, or did you fall into that area?
Well, I was for 3 years, I was a member of the tribunal panel of the Canadian Human Rights Commission.
Mm,
But I kind of got into that sort of from earlier work as a student still. I'm of Ukrainian background, and Ukraine has had this history of trouble with Russia. And you're probably familiar with the fact there's a war going on there now. And back in those days, there were dissidents coming out of the Soviet Union Not only Ukrainians, but Russians and Jews and others who were coming out of the Soviet Union. And I was involved in various ways with helping through sort of like Amnesty International type work where we were helping dissidents. I had the honor of helping one Soviet dissident, a guy named Danilo Shumuk, who spent 40 years in Soviet concentration camps as a political prisoner, and he was the world's longest imprisoned prisoner of conscience. And I spent, almost like 15 years, not full-time, but on this matter, trying to help him out, to get him out. And we actually successfully got him out. I think it was in 1987, if I'm not mistaken. And he came to Canada and I met him, and I had the opportunity to travel with him to the American Bar Association convention in San Francisco, where he spoke about his incarceration in the Soviet Union and how he survived for 40 years.
He must be one heck of a fascinating person to speak with. That his mindset must be phenomenal.
I asked him two insights into him. One is I asked him, Danilo, again, his name is Danilo Shumuk. It's a strange name. But anyway, I asked him, Danilo, how did you survive and not break, like others over 40 years? And he said, this was his answer. He said, there are carnal values and there are spiritual values. And some people will compromise themselves for carnal values. Mm-hmm. And by carnal values, even things like food, clothing, shelter, and your basic values. And he said, I was just never ready to compromise on that, in that way. But others were broken in their pursuit of carnal values. And the other interesting thing about the guy was, I take him out for breakfast. I said, what would you like? You can have anything you want for breakfast, Danilo. What do you want? He says, I want a Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola. Okay, Coca-Cola, So poor guy, spent his life in jail. So Coca-Cola was his reward, I guess.
I don't know much about the gentleman. Are there books written by him or about him?
There's a biography written about him. It's online. Danilo Shumuk. He spells his name Shumuk is the last name, and he's passed away now. He's dead. Right. But during his life, he was a leading dissident in the Soviet Union. And I'll just tell you one story about him that really registered with me is when we entered the room at the American Bar Association, there was a session going on where former dissidents from the Soviet Union were invited to be present and talk to the American bar leadership about human rights in the former Soviet Union. And there might have been about 24 dissidents there. And we entered through a side door. Danilo Shumuk and I followed him into the room. And as I entered the room, I watched in awe as the meeting stopped. And all these dissidents turned and looked at him. And when they looked at him, they all stood up. They all stood up, right, to honor him. They stopped the meeting and like they knew who he was right off the bat. Yeah. And then they resumed the session, telling the people listening about their lives in the former Soviet Union. So it was I guess, if you're that strong in character, I don't know if you ever heard anything by Jim Rohn. Do you know who Jim Rohn is?
I know Jim Rohn very well, studied him very deeply.
Yeah, so in his speeches, he used to talk about Christ going around and collecting the apostles, and he used to say, you follow me. He didn't need to say much more than that. It was his character that was electric enough that he could call people just by saying that, you drop what you're doing and follow me. Well, this guy, I'm not going to say he's Jesus Christ. I can't say that. but he had a character so strong that it emanated a sense of strength when you met him.
It's quite incredible. I mean, Viktor Frankl, another example, different
Yeah.
location. Maybe a similar story. Not
Oh
100% sure.
yeah.
Yeah,
I love his book, that Man's Search for Meaning. It
yes,
meant a lot to me to read that book.
right, right. I
Yeah.
can imagine. Yeah, immigration attorney, both in Canada and the US, and it seems like you've been practicing law for, gosh, if my maths is correct, 50 odd years.
Yeah, so it's true. I have. I've had quite a career. Strange as it may be, I think if you asked people, on our graduation back then, who of all these people in our class, there are 300 in our class, who
Mm.
would be a lawyer 50 years later? I would be the last guy. My thinking was I'd be the last guy to report I would still be a lawyer 15 years later. But here I am. And, for me, it's been a rewarding career, up and down. Not everything was perfect.
Mm.
Some hardships and hard times, but overall, it's been a worthwhile career.
And you're still practicing, if I'm correct.
Yes, I am. Yeah, I have the great joy in my life these days is, well, at least part of it is working with these young people who are here in the office and
Mm.
sort of cultivating their life and their career, helping them grow.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful thing to be able to do.
I touched on, Andy, during the introduction about the current political environment. I can't move on to the books yet until we have
Right.
a very quick banter around the election of the US president and
Right.
what that means for Canada and business in particular in Canada. There's a couple of very prominent topics that we see in the press at the moment: 25% tariffs and Canada becoming a state of the US. How is that resonating within the population across the border?
I'll tell you, uh, big concern, 25% tariff
Mm.
can really, it's like a bowling ball coming through, just for Canada, if that's imposed on Canada, economically, it's going to be a very serious hit for Canada. And
Yeah.
sadly, I can't say just yet whether it's been imposed yet or not. So far, I don't see any evidence of him
Mm.
imposing that tariff, although he has promised to impose the tariff on Canada. So a big concern in that area, especially because we're trying to be united in terms of the response that Canada is going to,
Right.
show to Trump. But
Yes.
we're not united because a province in Western Canada, which is the energy province, oil and gas province, has said, look, we're not prepared to threaten cutting energy out from the United States. And the supply
Mm.
of energy from that province to the United States is pretty heavy in terms of Western United States. I think they
Right.
supply something like 40% of the energy for California and the Western states. So there's this kind of a national interest dissonance over
Mm.
what exactly is on the table in terms of a reaction if this 25% tariff is imposed. And counter tariffs are planned. There's no doubt there will be counter tariffs. And one of the potential leaders for the Liberal Party, which is the ruling party in Canada and going
Mm.
through a leadership race right at this time, Chrystia Freeland has threatened dollar for dollar tariffs against the US if they impose a tariff on us. So that's where we are right now. And like 20 years ago, I may have been on the side of, well, let's talk to the US about, some kind of a joint
Mm.
organization or, life together. Not now. I'm on the Canadian side, and I do not favor any kind of unity with the United States. Indeed, there's been some talk about chipping away at California and the north and the western states to join Canada instead of the other way around. And in fact, Trump threatened that in a conversation with one of the Canadian premiers, I believe, and the premier shot back saying, "Well, 51st state, well, forget that. We want California and a few of the other states to become the 11th and 12th provinces of Canada," or whatever it was. So
we'll see the lobby groups going backwards and forwards. I can envision. Yeah. Interesting times ahead for sure.
Oh yeah.
If nothing else, it'll make good conversation in your circle for sure, within the law arena, as well as in the journal, the newspapers. So we'll see how it all plays out. All the best.
Yeah.
All the best with it.
Thanks.
Let's dive into the books, Andy, because
Sure.
it seems like we're going to talk about the young professional as the main topic. I mean, if I'm correct, it seems like in about the last half a dozen years, maybe a decade, you've really turned your attention to journalism through Forbes in the columns that you write, as well as I think 5 books now.
Yeah. I've sort of cultivated a relationship with young people in particular, trying to help them with their careers, and in the course of my work, I've helped over 10,000 clients with various legal problems. Most of them were young professionals, or people starting out in their lives, going to the US or Canada. And in doing so, I noticed that there were 3 principal areas of concern that were troubling these young people. And I think they trouble most of us, 1 or 2 or all 3 of them. And the 3 are money, time, and balance, those 3 questions. So the book, The Young Professional, that I've published, it's called A Real World Survival Guide for the New College Graduate. Discusses those 3 themes, and there's some stories thrown in there in the book also. But I'm hoping maybe spend a moment or 2 on the themes.
Yeah, for sure. I even though you're targeting the young professional, I can imagine those 3 items are relevant to pretty much the world in general. Money, time, and balance.
This book in particular is relevant, say, for example, for mothers going back into the workforce, or for new people coming into a country and trying to get their feet on the ground in a new job or whatever. That's particularly relevant territory for them. But even for guys like you and me, older fellows, you think we're not troubled by money, time, and balance? I mean, that's the 3 issues of my life all the time.
Absolutely.
So
absolutely. And then throw people in the mix, and it's a continuum. What was the inspiration? I know you've sort of touched on it, but I mean, was there a specific tipping point that got you to put pen to paper and produce the book?
Well, I was just thinking, here I am working with all these young people, and they're troubled by these kind of issues. And I'm a big Toastmaster guy. I've been in Toastmasters for many years, 35 years actually.
Wow.
And if you know Toastmasters, the big thing there is public speaking, but also leadership. Yes. And so I spent time reading about leadership, and that flows right into this area. And I decided, well, you can share your ideas, but a good way of leaving something for people is to put them into written words. And for the longest time, I've been handing out these books to young people coming through the office as just a little bit of help to them on their way out or when they're going into the world. And it's been useful. I found that sharing a book with someone, giving someone a book is far better than what, a bottle of wine or, some a box of candy or whatever. I think a book is a better gift. It's a more practical and more helpful gift for people. So that's how it started.
We certainly share that belief. I'm a strong believer in that. It's been a practice as well.
Oh,
What is, if we just do a high level dive into the three themes or the three
sure.
topics: money, time, and balance?
Right.
Maybe you could just introduce each one to a
Sure.
little bit deeper extent, if you
Oh,
don't.
yeah, sure. All right. With regard to money, the way I'm taking it now, if your name is John Paul Getty II or whatever, you don't have to worry about money or, Bill Gates's son or daughter or whatever. So I'm talking about just normal, ordinary people. I'm not talking about people who are going to inherit great wealth or, who get
Yeah.
hit it big on the super lotto or whatever it is. So I'm talking about normal people. In the case of normal people, when it comes to money, a key thing about money is, what are you spending your time on? What is the focus of your life? And is it on your unique abilities?
Hmm.
If it is, then there's good reason to believe you'll do well with regard to money. And I can get into that in a little more detail. On the issue of time, again, time is a focus question, but this time it's a question of priority setting. What priorities do you have in your life and how are you
Hmm.
setting them? And there's this, I'm sure you're familiar with it, the 80-20 rule as a rule for helping you decide what to do, when, and how. So I can talk a bit about that. And in the area of balance, what I talk about is values, whatever values you have,
Hmm.
and how you live your values. Are you equally living all your values, or are you cutting some values short? And there's a wheel that I use as an example of how are you a flat tire or are you a circular wheel? And that's the way I address that topic.
So I know the book has a lot of stories. As you were writing and doing research, I guess, let's dissect it now into each one. Stories around money. Did you come across stories of people who were able to do what you're suggesting and do it successfully?
Yes. I'm going to share one story. I'm not sure if I've got it in the book or not, but it's a story that comes to mind when you ask this question. And that's, I don't know if you've ever heard of Og Mandino. Do you know who that is? No.
I don't.
He wrote a book called The Greatest Salesman in the World, and it was a huge hit. And
Yes.
his life story is a really curious one. When he was growing up, his mother cultivated this idea that, Og, you should be a writer. You're going to be a great writer. But no, he wasn't really that interested in that. He got through high school. He wanted to get out into the world and, make a name for himself. And World War II broke out. And
Mhm.
he ended up going to Europe, and he was a bomber on an airplane with Jimmy Stewart, the actor, who was the same trooper squadron that he was in. And so he was somehow survived World War II and came back at the end of the war. But coming back to the United States in his life, there wasn't exactly a great need for a former bomber in World War II in terms of work. He couldn't find work. And his life sort of crashed, like he He worked here and there, not doing very well, got married, had a kid, couldn't support the family, became an alcoholic actually. And he hit rock bottom basically one day. He's walking down the street, as he tells the story. And it's worthwhile to look up the story just to hear it firsthand instead of through me. But the story goes that he's walking down the street and it's cold, and he looks into a window, a store window, and there was a gun for sale there, a pistol. And I think it was $10. And he reached into his pocket, and just at that time he had $10 left. And he thought to himself, why don't I just go and buy that gun and, put an end to this misery? Something made him pass by and forget that. And he went to the library and he started reading. And he read a book by W. Clement Stone about success. And I can't give you the exact name of the book off the top of my head, but I think it was like a positive attitude type book. And it turned his life around. And he started looking at, what he could do. And he was reminded of his mother's, words about writing and stuff like that. But he went to Clement Stone and asked if he could, join the insurance company that Clement Stone had. And Stone gave him a job, and he became, fairly good at insurance. Then Stone said to him, let's do a newsletter. You can write a newsletter for us. And he started writing a newsletter, and it turned into writing for Success Magazine. He became the editor of Success Magazine. Yeah. And then he went on to write these books, so focusing on some strength that you have. There's an example of someone who was able to do that.
Yeah, it's a great example, great story. What about the time you mentioned the 80-20 rule? I'm sure most listeners are familiar with it. Probably tried to practice it. I'm not sure we've all been successful in that endeavor, but the concept is probably well known.
Yeah, 80-20 rule. So it comes from Pareto, who was an economist in Italy, who analyzed the economy in Italy and came to the realization that 20% of the population owned 80% of the wealth. And then if you look at that, generally that rule seems to apply to a lot of things. So for example, 20% of the people in an organization are leaders, for example, and the 80% are followers, or 20% of an organization make 80% of the money of an organization, as an example. But the real big breakthrough for me in this area came from Jim Rohn, which we've talked about, in the way he translated that rule into a workable rule for me in my life. And that translation was, the way he put it is, when you're looking at something you want to get done, you're going to find that 80% of what you're trying to do can be resolved by focusing on 4 or 5 things, maybe 6 things that are key, and the rest is not so significant. So focus on 4 or 5, maybe 6 things, and pay 80% of your time on that, and 20% of your time on other stuff. And to illustrate this more concretely, suppose, for example, we were talking earlier, I think before we came on the air, about my background. I'm Ukrainian in background. Suppose you're President Zelensky and you're faced with a war with Putin in your country, and you're the president. Suppose you had to run the country. How would you run it using this formula? Well, what you would do is I would suppose, if I was him, you list all the things that need to be done: health, education, war, missiles, whatever it is, a whole list of things. And then you ask yourself, okay, we don't have resources to do all of this, but what resources, 4 or 5 things, can we spend 80% of our time on to get the 80% benefit that we're trying to get? and spend 80% on that and 20% on everything else. But, and so it might be, for example, ammunition, food, economy, whatever it is, and work with that kind of a formula. And you can get into this, you could pick each item. So for example, in the area of economy, what are the 4 or 5 things that are the most important things to do for the economy? And let's work on those 4 or 5 things and spend 80% of our time on those 4 or 5 things and 20% on the rest. And then, you can go on like this forever. It'll drive you crazy. But anyway, that's the way, that's time, doing the best with the time that you have available.
And we see examples of that all throughout business, throughout our lives. I mean, you've explained it very succinctly, but as a leader, we try and identify the things that are going to have the greatest impact, and we narrow that down and focus on those things. And what you're suggesting, I guess, is for young people, this is also a great piece of advice. Right? Yeah. Let's jump into the final one, which is the balance and your life wheel.
Okay.
As a coach, I'm familiar with the life wheel, so I like it very much. So I'll leave you introduce it and explain it.
Okay. All right. So balance is all about values, and values are subjective for the most part. There are some universal values, in my opinion. Like, for example, don't hurt anyone might be a universal value. Life is a universal value, but generally, most values are subjective values, meaning of value to whom? To you. So take me or you or some person as an example, and you might ask, well, what are your key values? What do you care about in your life? And I don't know what they may say, but let's say a person might say, well, I have spiritual values, and I have intellectual values, and I have physical. I want to be healthy. I want to be, thinking and emotional value, whatever it is. Or it can be something like, I want money. I want, a wife. I want kids or family, whatever it is. Whatever the values that you identify, let's imagine a bicycle tire. At the hub, there are spokes that reach out to the edges. And each one of those spokes can be represented by a value. So let's say physical health as a value. And you might put numbers on that spoke from 1 to 10, 10 being the outer edge of the spoke, 1 being in the inner edge where the hub is. And same with these other values. And you identify, let's say, 10 values that are critical in your life with these numbers. And then you ask, okay, how are you doing physically? Like how healthy are you physically? Between 1 and 10. Okay, maybe you're a 7. How are you doing intellectually? Are you nourishing your mind? And okay, maybe it's a 5. How are you doing spiritually? Are you tuning into the spiritual aspect of your life? It's a 6 or whatever. If you're a balanced human being, when you draw a line around the edges, you should end up with a circle, more or less a circle. If you don't, you're a flat tire because you're not paying attention to certain values that you profess to be your values, but you're not paying attention to them. You got a problem. You're not in balance. Now, it's okay to be out of balance for a while. To give you an illustration, when I wrote my bar exams, I had to be out of balance. I couldn't do everything. I had to pay attention to study for the bar exams for a few months to get through the bar exam. So I was out of balance for the purpose of attaining a higher goal. But then I had to come back into balance. I couldn't go like that forever. On the opposite end, if you're, say, a painter, and let's say you, like Van Gogh, where you love painting so much that you don't do anything else except paint. Well, if you got a brother who will support you so that you don't go, hungry and you got a place to live like he did, Well, he could spend all his life painting, but it was a life out of balance.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, he was a genius. So, he paid the price because he was a genius. But I don't know if we're, in a state where we want to pay that kind of a price for our lives.
Mm.
Depends on who you are. But that's a little comment about balance.
And I guess that comes then down to a large extent around self-awareness, being cognizant of what your values are and how much attention you actually pay to them, and whether you're
Correct.
living in that balance, in harmony with your values. And we talked so much about that in working for a company where the company values are not in alignment with your own personal values. And, we're sort of forced into a scenario where we're not living our personal values as a result of the company and the dichotomy that comes out of that, I guess. So there's a
Yeah,
great.
so there you got two sort of scenarios there. One is
Yeah.
you're lucky enough to find a company that is in harmony with your values.
Hmm.
Um, on the other hand, you may be in a situation where you have to join a company where the values are not in line with you. But even then, for example, with immigrants who come, the first job that they have the job is not likely to be in harmony with the higher values that they have,
True,
but they got a
true.
family to feed. So the value that they're supporting is looking after their family, which
Right.
is a high priority value.
Yes,
So
yes.
it's not quite what you want, but for the sake of the moment, because you want to look after your family, you're ready to, to take on this work, even though it's not quite, it's clashing with your higher values.
Mm. We could talk a long time around this single topic. It's so important for everybody to really grasp and understand. Unfortunately, time is always against us. Are you a futurist, Andy? I'm wondering how you see the future.
Well, I'm an optimist about the future. So, for example,
Okay.
I believe mankind can sort out the problem of climate change, even though it doesn't look like we're doing a good job right now.
Mm.
I do believe that a time will come when we'll be able to explore other planets and so on.
Yeah.
Things of that nature, I believe, are possible. But there are big problems that we have to solve. Nuclear, disarmament is an
Yeah.
issue that I think needs attention. Wars, genocides taking place in our lifetime. I don't know how we haven't learned how to live together just
Yes.
yet, the way we should. And there's a lot to learn yet.
And
Starting
of
with
course,
ourselves, we have to, educate ourselves. So have to roll up our sleeves and get to work.
and we have this enormous disruptor called technology that's
Yes.
really factoring into all of this and not making it any easier in that
No,
regard. So,
there's good and bad. That this
yeah.
AI seems to be like working with it is incredible, just unbelievable
Mm.
what you can do with it. Let's hope that it doesn't fall into the wrong hands and go in the wrong direction. But so far, I found it very, very interesting and helpful.
Oh, for sure. I definitely don't have any issue with the application at the moment. It's where it may or may not lead is, I guess, the unknown, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Unfortunately, time's against us, Andy. Been a fascinating conversation. We could, of course, go far deeper into the book, and I look forward to having the chance to read it. What is the best place to get hold of the book or books? And what about connecting with you? Um, where can people go and find and follow you?
Well, as far as the books are concerned, they're all on Amazon. If you're having trouble, you can go to myworkvisa.com and look under my books, and you can find whatever books that you need. That's my personal website. As far as contacting me is concerned, I work at Pace Law Firm in Toronto, PACE Law Firm. And you can get a hold of me through Pace Law Firm, the website, pacelawfirm.com.
Excellent. We'll make sure we link to all of that, and hopefully the listeners are as enthused by the conversation as I am. I've really taken a lot out of it. Thank you for that. Thanks for being a guest on the ET project. Wonderful to connect.
I'm very happy to have been on this program. Thank you so much, Wayne.
So what are you waiting for? Hit the subscribe button below and click on the bell icon so I can pop up in your feed occasionally with a great tip for your ultimate growth.